Good morning, everyone. At this time, I would like to call to order the Executive Committee meeting of the North County Transit District. Before we begin, members of the public who may be viewing the meeting on the district's YouTube page, in order to make a public comment during the meeting, you must connect to the meeting using the Zoom link provided on the agenda. In addition, you must also register to speak by sending an email containing your name or phone number and the agenda item on which you wish to speak to clerk@nctd.org. I will now ask Hannah King, our wonderful new deputy clerk of the board, to call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will now call the roll. Board Chair Edson.
Yes.
Vice Chair Bhat Patel.
She's here.
Board Member Jenkins.
Here.
Board Member Contreras.
Present.
That concludes the roll call.
Thank you, ma'am. Hannah, will you please provide a safety brief and review evacuation procedures?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will now read the safety brief and evacuation procedures. In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Thank you very much. Hannah, do we have any public comments today?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you. At this time, we're ending the public registration to provide general comment. Before we go into specific items on the agenda, I would like to outline meeting protocols to make this meeting as efficient as possible. First, please hold your comments and/or questions until after the agenda item has been presented. Second, when the time comes for board member comments or questions, please raise your hand and I'll call on you in dais order. The first item on the agenda today will be a review of the proposed modifications to board policies. We're seeking guidance from the executive committee before advancing the proposed modifications to the full board of directors for consideration. Lori Winfrey, General Counsel, will be presenting this item. Lori, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. So as you know, according to board policy number 1, every year we review the board policies, see if there's any administrative, legal, or regulatory changes that we are proposing to the board. We've done that this year, and there's several items. I don't intend to go through all of them, but clearly if the board has questions about any of them, please feel free to ask. Most of them are non-substantive in nature. Administrative, regulatory. For example, the government code section may have changed and we needed to modify a board policy to reflect that change and so forth. So here you'll see the first set of the non-substantive revisions. This is related to the board policies noted there. All of these were administrative in nature, and I did provide a brief comment on each one as to why we believe that the administrative change was necessary. I'm not going to go through each one of them as I noted, but if you have any questions about these, please just let me know. Same here for the next one, the next slide. These are also mostly legal, administrative in nature. There were some changes to some regulatory code citations and some updates to government code sections and so forth that required modification to these policies. Same here, legal and administrative for the ones noted here. All right, so these are the 3 board policies that do have proposed substantive revisions. The first one is the rail safety and community enhancement projects, board policy 18. As we all know, the board had an ad hoc committee over the course of the last year focused on rail safety and community enhancement. And that informed the discussions and the board committees related to that purpose, led to some proposed revisions to that policy. Board policy number 24, we have a proposed revision there that I will review with the board shortly. And then board policy number 3, as you know, we have several joint use and development projects that are either in progress or, bidding. And so through the last year or so, the policy, we believe, has evolved in terms of, lessons learned and, some things that we thought we could shore up in that policy to make it a little bit clearer what the board's purpose is. So with that, I'll start with the first one, which is board policy number 18. We made some modifications to that board policy to reflect, as I said, the feedback and the discussions from the REC committee. The primary changes there was to make it more clear and to clarify the roles of the jurisdiction, local jurisdictions versus SANDAG or NCTD, and establishing an MOU process for the design phase of the projects. And then we had the board policy before had stated that we have a cooperative agreement of some sort with the local jurisdiction during the construction and maintenance phases. But we use a license agreement for that purpose. And so I've made those modifications to the board policy to reflect that. In addition to that, there were some updates to the insurance indemnification terms just to make clear the prior version of the board policy did not clearly delineate between the design phase versus the construction phase and the maintenance phase. And so we made that more clear. We broke it out and made sure that it was clear that we have differing conditions based on what phase of the project that we're in. Are there any questions of the board as it relates to this particular policy? Yes, please.
Board Member Contreras?
Thank you so much. Yes, this is really exciting. First when we discussed it, who knows when, a few months ago at this point. But my question is, it says a lead agency may request. So where does the request, where is that formalized? Is that in the MOU process that, say, for example, I just want to take the example at City of Vista with the grade separation funds that we got from Congressman Mike Levin. If there's an MOU, does the city have to say, hey, maybe it would be best if, you and you are the lead on this project? Is that where it happens?
Yeah, I have Lillian here, but yes, during the negotiations for the MOU, I think that's where you would identify who was best at, implementing that project, I guess you would say, in the design phase. So for example, with the Vista one that you mentioned, I know we've had discussions around the fact that NCTD has, expertise with implementing projects with that type of funding, coming from the FTA, whereas the city may not have, that expertise. We also have consulting contracts already that the board has approved that we could utilize for those purposes. That can save time, especially if you have, a deadline to use the funding. That would just be part of the negotiations, I think, in the initial design phase MOU.
Okay, awesome.
Yes, I fully agree. I think some of the cities have identified that in terms of grant funding, they would like to leverage NCTD resources in terms of reporting requirements because they often don't have the same level of expertise and experience when it comes to federal and state grants, whereas we often do that as part of our regular day-to-day practice. So they really appreciate our support in particularly those roles as well.
Awesome. And just as a follow-up, is one of the main reasons why this change has occurred, is that so we could be more competitive for this funding?
I think that's one of the things that we identified through the REC committee was that working jointly together and making sure that we have the expertise, that we can demonstrate the elements of compliance with the grants does make us more competitive in some cases for that funding.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you all so much for your work on this. And I look forward to being more competitive.
Thank you, Board Member Contreras. Board Member Jenkins.
A quick follow-up question. You mentioned about the local jurisdictions maybe using the North County Transit resources. Will North County Transit be reimbursed our time and costs for that? Will that be put into the MOU?
Yes, as part of our board policy, it does require that we collect for our resources that support the local cities initiatives in furthering these projects. So that is all included as part of the MOU.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. No questions? I thank you, Lillian.
All right, in that case, we'll move on to the next board policy with substantive changes. And this one is our employee drug and alcohol policy. There were administrative changes to this one just to update, the medical review officer, the name of that individual, testing lab, things like that. But the one thing that we did add was a reasonable cause testing. And this is primarily related to safety critical and operational staff. It's not mandated by DOT. It would be under NCTD authority. The collective bargaining agreements that we have that exist with our operations staff presently includes a provision where they agree to comply with NCTD policies related to drug and alcohol, even if they weren't promulgated until after the fact. And so in this particular case, we identified that we had kind of a gap, I guess you could say, in this type of testing where we have, let's say we have a rules violation out in the field. We did not have an NCTD authority for reasonable cause testing. And so we've included that now in the policy that we're asking the board to adopt. Any questions on that one? Okay.
No questions.
All right, so the next one, board policy number 33, joint use and development of real property. Like I said, it's over the course of the last several years, it's been a new field for us in terms of looking at development of these properties, and the processes have evolved. We've had lessons learned, through various trial and error. And so this, the modifications requested to this policy reflect those proposed changes and that, the lessons learned. One of the primary things that we've done with this policy is include a provision that would require the developers to look at transit amenities as part of their proposal. So for example, bus shelters, at bus stops, or, trash cans, or, things of that nature that will assist our transit passengers. Since this is, primarily transit oriented development, we wanted to make sure that that was clear, that that was one of the board's prerequisites. And then the second thing that's fairly significant and, definitely from a lessons learned perspective is we included here that the developers must pay prevailing wages for the projects that they're implementing, because we've had a lot of conversations around this with some of our proposers, and even in the Q&A or the questions and answers leading up to proposals about what their prevailing wages required. And we've done a lot of research on this. It's very, very difficult to separate, public and private. If there's any funding coming from the transit district as part of, the development. But if you're getting some sort of incentive, like, let's say that we're providing an incentive where, there's no lease payment for 5 years or something like that. That's taxpayer dollars, right? That you would be collecting otherwise. And so it's the analysis is very complex. And so we've put clearly in the new board policy, assuming the board adopts this one, that this is required unless the developer can demonstrate that they have separated the two elements of the project, the one where there might be some public benefit or input versus, they're solely private enterprise, and they have an opinion from the Attorney General or from the DIR that demonstrates to us that prevailing wage is not required. So that's the primary difference in the policy.
Okay. Any questions on that one? Board Member Contreras?
Yeah, just to clarify, because a lot of folks get subcontractors. So the subcontractors would be as well as the general contractor
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, the prevailing wage would cover the entirety of the project unless they provide a formal written opinion to us from the DIR that says otherwise.
Okay. And we don't have a local hire stipulation.
No.
just prevailing wage is going to be made very clear.
Exactly.
So maybe we can get less questions about it, I guess, in the
Exactly.
future.
Yeah, we've,
All right.
we've spent a lot of time in discussions and negotiations with developers about that. And we've sort of landed on, if you can bring us a letter from the DIR that says that certain elements are not required, prevailing wage is not required, then we will consider that. But otherwise, it's going to be applicable to the entirety of the project.
Awesome. Well, I
It'd be
appreciate
great.
the change.
Yeah, it's great to point to the board policy to say, the board policy says this, we can't waive a board policy unless the board decides to do that, so. But if it's the law, then it can't even be waived, right? So anyway, that's the primary change on that one. Those are the only three that have really substantive changes. So assuming that the executive committee is agreeable and authorizes us to do so, this would go to, all the board policies would go to the board at the October board meeting on consent for approval of the full board by resolution.
Okay, thank you. Director Jenkins?
Question, Lori. In these projects coming up, are there any parts of them at some point that would not be on? They're all on North County Transit property, correct?
Yes.
So could there be any parts of them where some of it could be privately developed for instance, in San Marcos, we have a lot of property that we own and a lot of, we deal with this. And so sometimes there's, for instance, in our shopping center, the tenant may do the improvements. They don't have to do prevailing wage. But if we do the improvements, we have to pay prevailing wage. So my question is, I don't see where if it's all on our property, I don't know where any of it would be private. Would there be?
That is a really good question. And it's a very complex, it sounds so simple, but it's very
not.
complex. There's some opinions that basically say that, Attorney General opinions, for example, or DIR opinions that say, you could have, let's say you have a piece of property that you're leasing to a private developer. You've competitively selected someone. Their enterprise is solely public. They're not providing anything back to the district, for example, parking or something of that nature. So there's no concessions, there's no taxpayer dollars going into that. They're only paying the district taxpayer dollars for a lease, for example. It sounds simple, it's complex, but I have seen some opinions where they've said, okay, perhaps this is wholly a public enterprise and there's only money coming back to government rather than money going into the enterprise. So it's very complex. And so you would have to look at each scenario individually and the case law that's applicable.
And did you say the developer would be the one to get the opinion?
Yes.
Not the public agency?
No,
Not
because
us.
our position is going to be assuming the board
Okay,
adopts
so-
this policy that prevailing wage is applicable unless they can demonstrate to us otherwise from the regulatory agency.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Is that it? Board Member Patel? No, nothing. I have a question, Lori, under updated transit amenities, the second bullet,
Yes.
for joint development projects to include transit corridors. Can you define transit corridor in this instance?
I think Lillian will be better at doing that.
I had a feeling it was coming up to you, Lillian. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. So when we talk about transit corridors, we're particularly talking about oftentimes the inland rail trail, the coastal rail trail, the connectivity to pedestrian travel, just to make sure that developers are considering the full transit system for active transportation, because it is so critical in order to close that first mile, last mile, that we are thinking about how are our riders going to come to our station. It needs to be accessible, it needs to be highly visible, and we need to recognize that the transit center needs to highlight those amenities and also improve those connection options.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay. Oh, where's the Rick Jenkins?
So the developers that have submitted for the current projects on the table, were they aware from the very beginning that they will be paying prevailing wage? 'Cause
Yes.
It's about how much more? 30%?
Oh, it's
It-
definitely more, but our RFP says prevailing wages are required. They want to challenge that.
Okay, but they
And-
knew when they bid.
Exactly.
Okay,
So they want to challenge that, and we've said, we're not willing to entertain that unless you can demonstrate to us that the DIR agrees with you that that prevailing wage is not applicable to that whatever portion of their project that they would like to not pay prevailing wages for.
and do we have just an estimate of what that increased cost might be? I've heard maybe 30%, but is that just a generality? Could it be
Yes.
as high as 50% more?
We haven't heard 50%.
Okay.
We have heard 30% is
Okay.
about the standard. But there are numerous factors that go into like labor wages. So 30% again is the general,
Okay,
but it could be different.
Okay.
by a
Yeah,
few
it really
percentage points.
depends on the trades that are required for a particular job. It might be 50% for one particular trade, but 30 for another, 25 for another. I think 30 is a good estimate
okay,
overall.
thanks.
Okay, I think we're done with this item. Yes, okay, please, Lori, move to the next one.
So the next one, I believe, is this. On to the next agenda item.
Okay,
Madam Chair.
Hannah, were there any public comments on this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. At this time, we're ending the public registration to speak on item 1. Item 2 is receive calendar year 2024 legislative agenda. Hannah, do we have any public comments on this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Madam
Thank
Chair.
you. Thank you very much for being here and for presenting this item.
Yes, Chris Orlando, Chief Planning and Communications Officer, and here with Mary Dover, our Governmental Affairs Officer. We're going to present our recommended calendar year 2024 legislative agenda. So first slide, please. So each year, the executive committee reviews the legislative agenda and the board of directors approves. So you don't have formal action today. You're just providing input, and then we will bring the legislative agenda to the board at the December or October 19th meeting for the full board's approval. The document guides NCTD's legislative activities at the federal, state, and local level. It's basically a framework for us to assess legislation and its impacts on NCTD and our potential positions on those legislation. The board last approved a legislative agenda on October 20th, 2022. So we do this every calendar year. So we do the legislative agenda now, and then before the end of the year, in November or in December, we'll bring before you, before the board, the discretionary grant strategy as well, which is the second piece of our government affairs program. Next slide, please. So just wanted to provide just an overview of our overall legislative program. So you receive each month in your board packet a intergovernmental affairs report, which details all the tracked legislation, its potential impact on NCTD, and the status of that legislation. So you get that for both state and federal legislation. We track those impacts internally, and we also have contracted partners at the state and federal levels who help us track that legislation, connect with lawmakers, monitor developments. So we provide the board with those updates on a monthly basis. In addition to those reports, our representatives and NCTD staff as well are actively meeting with government officials, with our counterparts, with other stakeholders around the legislation that impacts us, funding and other things that from a governmental affairs standpoint impact the agency. Next slide, please. So this is just a list of some of the contacts we've made. So these would be direct contacts that we've made. So these are in person, us meeting directly with these officials or officials from these entities. And it ranges from one-on-one meetings to testifying at hearings, to doing legislative visits, just depends on the organization. So for example, California Air Resources Board, Mary and I were in Sacramento as their resources board considered the in-use rail locomotive rule and testified at the hearing on behalf of NCTD. We were both in DC in March, visiting the FTA and the FRA. I was there just last week with the California Transportation Association. I'm visiting with both FTA and FRA, as well as a number of legislative offices on the Hill. So these are active engagements and things that we do on a weekly and monthly basis to make sure that our legislative agenda is furthered. In addition to that, we are also very active in our industry associations and engaged through those groups. So APTA, American Public Transit Association, we frequently engage in their events. They do an annual legislative event in March, as well as their annual meeting in October. We are members of their legislative committee, so that helps us track legislation that impacts the agency. And we also serve as panelists at their conferences and have spoken at their events as well, representing the district. California Transit Association, I serve as vice chair of their federal legislative committee. Mary is a member of their state legislative committee, so we're very active in the CTA. Commuter Rail Coalition is a national commuter rail entity that we are active in. Katie Persons from our team was there last week talking on a panel at CRA in Chicago. CalAct, we served as panelists at CalAct, which is a association for smaller agencies here in California, and COMPTA, which is another organization around minority transit officials. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk about some of our successes in FY23 and the legislative platform for calendar year 24.
So this is the fun part. So we do all of the outreach. And out of all of that outreach and out of that big legislative program, we have some, as Chris mentioned, some wins from the calendar year 2023. My pride and joy, the $100 million grant we received from the state of California to further the San Diego Double Track Phase 2 project. Throughout mine and Chris's outreach, this project has stood out because of the ridership gains that we'll get from it. People are very excited about the special events platform at the Del Mar Fair. So we are seeking another $130 million from the federal government to complete the project. We have 2 pending applications for that. I'd like to consider those wins, but not yet. We also received a $29.3 million grant from the FTA to purchase 23 hydrogen fuel cell electric buses. Coupled with that will be workforce training to ensure that NCTD's existing workforce is able to transition to maintaining and operating these new zero emission buses.
By the way, one point on this grant, just this is something that came out when I was in DC last week. We were one of the largest recipients of this grant program nationally, and California got a disproportionately smaller proportion of this funding this year. And so our grant at the $29 million was a really significant grant nationally. So just wanted to call it out. It was a big win for us.
And part of that, and why we think it was so successful, was we partnered with Palomar College and are seeking to expand that partnership to other community colleges in the area for them to develop an apprenticeship program so that we can have a continuous pipeline of highly skilled workers coming to NCTD and also to any other entity in San Diego, in California, possibly nationally, for entities that have employees for hydrogen fuel cell or zero emission buses. We also helped Sandag, who's our partner on many of these big projects. They received a $103 million grant to complete the Bataquitos Lagoon double track project. As it's named, it will double track across the Bataquitos Lagoon, further allowing NCTD and Amtrak and other partners freight to increase service frequencies on the corridor. We also have received at least, for my tallies, 1.1 million in state and federal planning grants. We recently pushed out a press release last week noting that we received a climate adaptation planning grant from the Caltrans Planning Grant Program. That grant will help us assess our current infrastructure, determine the potential risks, and then plan for the resiliency of all of our assets and infrastructure. Next slide, please. For federal government appropriations, we worked with several legislators as well as through the American Public Transportation Association and the California Transit Association to include our priorities in the FY24 appropriations bill. Some of the language on this slide is vague because we weren't sure what was going to happen this weekend. Congress passed a continuing resolution, so all is well for now. Included in the consolidated appropriations bill for FY24 is $500,000 in community project funding that Congressman Scott Peters helped us secure for battery electric buses that will be deployed out of our Escondido bus yard. Next slide, please. Another one of our achievements, we worked through the California Transit Association to secure 5.1 billion in transit funding from two separate pots. These two sources of funding, which we presented to you in July ad nauseum, so I won't go over it too much. They will come to us by formula. So it's a secure source of funding that we can use to match other grants and complete some of our priority projects. From the TRCP, NCTD is expected to receive 48 million. And then from the Zero Emission Transit Capital Program, we're expected to receive 6.2 million this year and a similar amount for the next 5 fiscal years. We also supported AB 719, which is a state legislation, piece of legislation that will increase the amount NCTD is reimbursed for completing non-medical and non-emergency medical trips on our Lyft service. Right now, NCTD receives only about a $5 reimbursement through ticket price for this, and we could receive a pretty significant additional amount for that. It is pending before Governor Newsom at this moment. He has until October 14th to act on it. So here is an overview. So that was kind of an overview of what was completed under the calendar year 2023 agenda. This is what we're proposing for the calendar year 2024 agenda. It is a lot, but there aren't a ton of changes from the calendar year 2023 agenda. I will highlight that we modified some of the language in one of the provisions to support seeking permanent funding for free and reduced fare programs. We replaced language that would have allowed for flexibility in the LC Top program. That legislation was successfully passed, so we modified that to ensure that we get sustained revenue for any of those programs. These are just some important dates for you to remember. We enact this legislative agenda relatively early comparatively, but we want to make sure that we're well prepared. The California legislature and US Congress typically reconvene in January. At the state level, assembly members and senators have until usually mid-February to introduce bills. They can introduce kind of a placeholder and then they can gut it and amend it to make it similar to what it was, but to have more detail later on. But typically the bills have to be in before mid-February. And then we're always keeping an eye on the appropriations process. Typically starts in March of every year for the following fiscal year. Pass back to Chris.
And at this juncture, we'll take your questions or feedback. Again, there's no formal vote of the legislative platform. It will be on the board's consent item agenda in the October 19th meeting. So with that, we'll take the questions.
Well, thank you. Hannah, are there any public comments on this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Chris and Mary, lots of great news. Thank you so much. Great job on the grants. And I'm really excited about the regional partnerships with local stakeholders like Palomar College. I know we were out there celebrating that recently. Outstanding job working with the state and federal elected officials to help move those grants in our direction. A couple of things on the outreach slide with the announcement made by the Pro Tem Atkins. Would we want to add Mark McGuire to this list? And then also with the unfortunate passing of Senator Feinstein, would we also want to add, and the appointment of LaFonza Butler, would we also want to add that name?
Of course, yeah.
Okay,
So
thank you.
The list was the contacts we had the prior year, so we'll add those to our.
Right. Well, and all of this is pretty breaking news. So.
It is, yeah.
All right. Staying on top of all of that. Any questions? A board member Contreras.
I actually don't have any questions. You know what? Scratch that. I have one question. Are we going to be the first transit agency that's going to have hydrogen fuel cell on the road, or in California or in our region, or Where are we at with that?
No, we actually, there are a couple, the one that comes to mind, AC Transit in the Bay Area has, their goal is to do, I think, 70% hydrogen and 30% battery electric. Other agencies are doing a similar mixed fleet like we are to determine which one is going to end up being better, which technology for us in the long run.
All right, Blu-ray versus high definition. Okay, and so are we, since they're a little bit ahead of us, what's our collaboration like on best practices?
Yeah, so we're actually, a couple things. One, we have some consultant studies that we will do to assess the bus program. So that means, as we deploy the two technologies, assessing how they do, where the deployments work well, what types of routes, those sorts of things. So we're doing that internally. And then externally, we absolutely collaborate. In fact, we had the ZEB conference occurred last Thursday here in San Diego. So that's Zero Emission Bus Conference. And we actually gave a tour to about 50 individuals from around the country who toured our East and West bus facilities to provide feedback. And we described what they were doing. We collaborated. So it was a really good industry knowledge sharing event that happened just last week.
Very awesome. Okay, I look forward to that. And I just want to echo Chair Edson's comments. This is incredible. You all did just so much work to try and bring in a lot of money into NCTD, and it really will pay dividends for us and for our customers. So thank you.
Board Member Jenkins.
Yes, I think you both already touched on it, but it's nice to see these numbers on paper because we get the emails saying we received this grant or this whatever, but to see it all together is pretty amazing with a small group. Look what you accomplished. So just kudos on that. Again, and then on the page where you talked about the 24 agenda, I have a question about where you talked about supporting the opposition to legislation that includes unfunded mandates for NCTD. Does anybody ever listen?
It's a double negative. Isn't it?
No, I had to look, I had to read it a couple times at the beginning, but does anybody ever listen about unfunded mandates? I mean, I know we want to support the opposition, but do we have any chance of anything there?
It varies. What that item lets us do is to be able to take a position on those type of things where something is presenting a significant unfunded mandate for. So it lets us, so that's why it's there. So we can take a position on legislation that includes something that's unfunded.
So, and you could get back to us if you don't have this, but what would be an approximate amount of dollars that we're spending on unfunded mandates? Do we have any idea what that number is?
I don't have an estimate
Okay.
for you, but
It would be curious to know. I don't even know
Yeah,
how easy it would be to pull that together, but is that all general fund type money
varies,
or not
so-
necessarily?
Yeah, it would vary, and it depends how you define it as well, right? So we have the zero emission bus transition, the zero emission rail transition. Both those rules came down without specific funding
Right.
tied to
Okay.
them, right? So
PTC.
the PTC is
Yeah,
another one.
We're
So
talking about a lot of
yeah,
money.
it's a lot of money. It would be difficult to draw a circle
Okay.
around how much. Generally, those programs follow grant opportunities, but by and large, and this is part of the argument we've been making, we made last week in DC, is California is under the mandates, but all the programs we apply to are discretionary. And so, you have to adhere to the mandate, but you have to compete for the funding. So it creates this challenging dynamic.
Mhm. It's many millions of dollars, I'm sure. Hundreds of millions, probably. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Board Member Patel or Vice Chair Patel.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. Echo the sentiments of my colleagues about how amazing the team did with regards to bringing in funds, and looking forward to more. I know we'll continue to encourage you all to keep going out there and doing that. And really quick question, because I know this past legislative cycle, there were thousands and thousands of bills that went before the legislature. This is just out of curiosity. Is there a way that do we have a software that we utilize to track legislation that like alerts you? I mean, besides just ledge info, is there something else that we're using that's a bit more sophisticated to say, hey, this is something we really need to pay attention to?
We don't have software internally that does it, but we do
Okay.
it through two ways. So it's through both the National Association, so ABDA,
Okay.
and California CTA.
Yeah,
So they track and are sophisticated in dialing. And
Okay.
then we also have legislative advocates who do the same for us. So that look out specifically for legislation that impacts CTV specifically,
okay,
both at the federal and state levels. And then Mary's a legislative geek, so she gets in there. And
They do use legend.
yeah, I know, right?
So yeah, so those three layers provide us the coverage, and generally between those layers, that flags most everything.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. I just think food for thought, because I know that in my past jobs, I've had to utilize some of that software, and I feel like it's really awesome. And I'm not gonna shout out specific software. I can let you all discuss if that's something you all feel like, but I'm happy to chat offline about different ones, because I think that would, I don't know, it just ups your game more, you know? I mean, if we're already up to speed on things, that's awesome. But if we're trying to surpass all these awesome targets that we've already hit, maybe it gets us that one step closer, even if it's just, I know usually the ballpark is like, depending on what we're doing, like for an agency this size, I think it's like 50 grand or something for the year, but, or a couple of years, something like that for 2 years. So it's not too bad. Yeah.
Well, I think that's all. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Like I said, good to hear all the good news. Next on the agenda to be discussed is closed session. Excuse me. Next on our agenda is closed session, and we will be discussing the recruitment of the appointment of the executive director, Lori Winfrey, General Counsel. Can you please take us into closed session?
Yes, Madam Chair. So we do have the one item noted by our board chair, closed session pursuant to Government Code Section 54957, subsection B1. And this is related to the appointment to position of executive director.
Lori Winfrey, General Counsel. We're back from closed session. Do you have anything to report?
There was no reportable action.
Thank you very much. The next scheduled meetings are the Executive Committee meeting, October 19th, 2023 at 11 a.m. The regular board meeting, October 19th, 2023 at 2 p.m. MISPADA, the Marketing, Service Planning and Business Development meeting at October 31st, 2023 at 1 p.m. This meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.